Part 2. I was questioned several times immediately after my arrest. But they were all formal examinations, as to my identity and so forth. At the first of these, which took place at the police station, nobody seemed to have much interest in the case. However, when I was brought before the examining magistrate a week later, I noticed that he eyed me with distinct curiosity. Like the others, he began by asking my name, address, and occupation, the date and place of my birth. Then he inquired if I had chosen a lawyer to defend me. I answered, no, I hadn't thought about it, and asked him if it was really necessary for me to have one. Why do you ask that? He said. I replied that I regarded my case as very simple. He smiled. Well, it may seem so to you. But we've got to abide by the law, and, if you don't engage a lawyer, the court will have to appoint one for you. It struck me as an excellent arrangement that the authorities should see to details of this kind, and I told him so. He nodded, and agreed that the code was all that could be desired. At first I didn't take him quite seriously. The room in which he interviewed me was much like an ordinary sitting room, with curtained windows, and a single lamp standing on the desk. Its light fell on the armchair in which he'd had me sit, while his own face stayed in shadow. I had read descriptions of such scenes in books, and at first it all seemed like a game. After our conversation, however, I had a good look at him. He was a tall man with clean-cut features, deep-set blue eyes, a big grey mustache, and abundant, almost snow-white hair, and he gave me the impression of being highly intelligent and, on the whole, likable enough. There was only one thing that put one off. His mouth had now and then a rather ugly twist, but it seemed to be only a sort of nervous tic. When leaving, I very nearly held out my hand and said, "Goodbye," just in time I remembered that I killed a man. Next day a lawyer came to my cell, a small, plump, youngish man with sleek black hair. In spite of the heat, I was in my shirt sleeves. He was wearing a dark suit, stiff collar, and a rather showy tie, with broad black and white stripes. After depositing his briefcase on my bed, he introduced himself, and added that he'd perused the record of my case with the utmost care. His opinion was that it would need cautious handling, but there was every prospect of my getting off, provided I followed his advice. I thanked him, and he said, "Good. Now let's get down to it." Sitting on the bed, he said that they'd been making investigations into my private life. They had learned that my mother died recently in a home. Inquiries had been conducted at Marengo, and the police informed that I'd shown great callousness at my mother's funeral. "You must understand," the lawyer said, "that I don't relish having to question you about such a matter. But it has much importance, and, unless I find some way of answering the charge of callousness, I shall be handicapped in conducting your defense. And that is where you, and only you, can help me." He went on to ask if I had felt grief on that sad occasion. The question struck me as an odd one. I'd have been much embarrassed if I'd had to ask anyone a thing like that. I answered that, of recent years, I'd rather lost the habit of noting my feelings, and hardly knew what to answer. I could truthfully say I'd been quite fond of mother, but really that didn't mean much. All normal people, I added as an afterthought, had more or less desired the death of those they loved, at some time or another. Here the lawyer interrupted me, looking greatly perturbed. "You must promise me not to say anything of that sort at the trial, or to the examining magistrate." I promised, to satisfy him, but I explained that my physical condition at any given moment often influenced my feelings. For instance, on the day I attended Mother's funeral, I was fagged out and only half awake. So, really, I hardly took stock of what was happening. Anyhow, I could assure him of one thing, that I'd rather Mother hadn't died. The lawyer, however, looked displeased. "That's not enough," he said curtly. After considering for a bit, he asked me if he could say that on that day I had kept my feelings under control. "No," I said. "That wouldn't be true." He gave me a queer look, as if I slightly revolted him, then informed me, in an almost hostile tone, that in any case the head of the home and some of the staff would be cited as witnesses. "And that might do you a very nasty turn," he concluded. When I suggested that Mother's death had no connection with the charge against me, he merely replied that this remark showed I'd never had any dealings with the law. Soon after this he left, looking quite vexed. I wished he had stayed longer, and I could have explained that I desired his sympathy, not for him to make a better job of my defense, but, if I might put it so, spontaneously. I could see that I got on his nerves. He couldn't make me out, and, naturally enough, this irritated him. Once or twice I had a mind to assure him that I was just like everybody else, quite an ordinary person. But really that would have served no great purpose, and I let it go, out of laziness as much as anything else. Later in the day I was taken again to the examining magistrate's office. It was 2 in the afternoon and, this time, the room was flooded with light. There was only a thin curtain on the window, and extremely hot. After inviting me to sit down, the magistrate informed me in a very polite tone that, owing to unforeseen circumstances, my lawyer was unable to be present. I should be quite entitled, he added, to reserve my answers to his questions until my lawyer could attend. To this I replied that I could answer for myself. He pressed a bell push on his desk and a young clerk came in and seated himself just behind me. Then I and the magistrate, settled back in our chairs and the examination began. He led off by remarking that I had the reputation of being a taciturn, rather self-centered person, and he'd like to know what I had to say to that. I answered, well, I rarely have anything much to say. So, naturally, I keep my mouth shut. He smiled as on the previous occasion, and agreed that that was the best of reasons. In any case, he added, it has little or no importance. After a short silence he suddenly leaned forward, looked me in the eyes, and said, raising his voice a little, what really interests me is, you. I wasn't quite clear what he meant, so I made no comment. There are several things, he continued, that puzzle me about your crime. I feel sure that you will help me to understand them. When I replied that really it was quite simple, he asked me to give him an account of what I'd done that day. As a matter of fact, I had already told him at our first interview, in a summary sort of way, of course, about Raymond, the beach, our swim, the fight, then the beach again, and the 5 shots I'd fired. But I went over it all again, and after each phrase he nodded. Quite so, quite so. When I described the body lying on the sand, he nodded more emphatically, and said, good. I was tired of repeating the same story. I felt as if I'd never talked so much in all my life before. After another silence, he stood up and said he'd like to help me. I interested him, and, with God's help, he would do something for me in my trouble. But, first, he must put a few more questions. He began by asking bluntly if I'd loved my mother. Yes, I replied, like everybody else. The clerk behind me, who had been typing away at a steady pace, must just then have hit the wrong keys, as I heard him pushing the carrier back and crossing something out. Next, without any apparent logical connection, the magistrate sprang another question. Why did you fire 5 consecutive shots? I thought for a bit, then explained that they weren't quite consecutive. I fired 1 at first, and the other 4 after a short interval. Why did you pause between the first and second shot? I seemed to see it hovering again before my eyes, the red glow of the beach, and to feel that fiery breath on my cheeks, and, this time, I made no answer. During the silence that followed, the magistrate kept fidgeting, running his fingers through his hair, half rising, then sitting down again. Finally, planting his elbows on the desk, he bent toward me with a queer expression. But why did you go on firing at a prostrate man? Again I found nothing to reply. The magistrate drew his hand across his forehead and repeated in a slightly different tone, I ask you, why? I insist on your telling me. I still kept silent. Suddenly he rose, walked to a file cabinet standing against the opposite wall, pulled a drawer open, and took from it a silver crucifix, which he was waving as he came back to the desk. Do you know who this is? His voice had changed completely, it was vibrant with emotion. Of course I do, I answered. That seemed to start him off. He began speaking at a great pace. He told me he believed in God, and that even the worst of sinners could obtain forgiveness of him. But first he must repent, and become like a little child, with a simple, trustful heart, open to conviction. He was leaning right across the table, brandishing his crucifix before my eyes. As a matter of fact, I had great difficulty in following his remarks, as, for one thing, the office was so stiflingly hot and big flies were buzzing round and settling on my cheeks, also because he rather alarmed me. Of course, I realized it was absurd to feel like this, considering that, after all, it was I who was the criminal. However, as he continued talking, I did my best to understand, and I gathered that there was only one point in my confession that badly needed clearing up, the fact that I'd waited before firing a second time. All the rest was, so to speak, quite in order, but that completely baffled him. I started to tell him that he was wrong in insisting on this, the point was of quite minor importance. But, before I could get the words out, he had drawn himself up to his full height and was asking me very earnestly if I believed in God. When I said, no, he plumped down into his chair indignantly. That was unthinkable, he said, all men believe in God, even those who reject him. Of this he was absolutely sure, if ever he came to doubt it, his life would lose all meaning. Do you wish, he asked indignantly, my life to have no meaning? Really, I couldn't see how my wishes came into it, and I told him as much. While I was talking, he thrust the crucifix again just under my nose and shouted, I, anyhow, am a Christian. And I pray him to forgive you for your sins. My poor young man, how can you not believe that he suffered for your sake? I noticed that his manner seemed genuinely solicitous when he said, my poor young man, but I was beginning to have enough of it. The room was growing steadily hotter. As I usually do when I want to get rid of someone whose conversation bores me, I pretended to agree. At which, rather to my surprise, his face lit up. You see. You see. Now won't you own that you believe and put your trust in him? I must have shaken my head again, for he sank back in his chair, looking limp and dejected. For some moments there was a silence during which the typewriter, which had been clicking away all the time we talked, caught up with the last remark. Then he looked at me intently and rather sadly. Never in all my experience have I known a soul so case-hardened as yours, he said in a low tone. All the criminals who have come before me until now wept when they saw this symbol of our Lord's sufferings. I was on the point of replying that was precisely because they were criminals. But then I realized that I, too, came under that description. Somehow it was an idea to which I never could get reconciled. To indicate, presumably, that the interview was over, the magistrate stood up. In the same weary tone he asked me a last question, did I regret what I had done? After thinking a bit, I said that what I felt was less regret than a kind of vexation, I couldn't find a better word for it. But he didn't seem to understand. This was as far as things went at that day's interview. I came before the magistrate many times more, but on these occasions my lawyer always accompanied me. The examinations were confined to asking me to amplify my previous statements. Or else the magistrate and my lawyer discussed technicalities. At such times they took very little notice of me, and, in any case, the tone of the examinations changed as time went on. The magistrate seemed to have lost interest in me, and to have come to some sort of decision about my case. He never mentioned God again or displayed any of the religious fervor I had found so embarrassing at our first interview. The result was that our relations became more cordial. After a few questions, followed by an exchange of remarks with the lawyer, the magistrate closed the interview. My case was taking its course, as he put it. Sometimes, too, the conversation was of a general order, and the magistrate and lawyer encouraged me to join in it. I began to breathe more freely. Neither of the two men, at these times, showed the least hostility toward me, and everything went so smoothly, so amiably, that I had an absurd impression of being one of the family. I can honestly say that during the 11 months these examinations lasted I got so used to them that I was almost surprised at having ever enjoyed anything better than those rare moments when the magistrate, after escorting me to the door of the office, would pat my shoulder and say in a friendly tone, "Well, Mr. Antichrist, that's all for the present." After which I was made over to my jailers. There are some things of which I've never cared to talk. And, a few days after I'd been sent to prison, I decided that this phase of my life was one of them. However, as time went by, I came to feel that this aversion had no real substance. In point of fact, during those early days, I was hardly conscious of being in prison. I had always a vague hope that something would turn up, some agreeable surprise. The change came soon after Marie's first and only visit. From the day when I got her letter telling me they wouldn't let her come to see me anymore, because she wasn't my wife, it was from that day that I realized that this cell was my last home, a dead end, so to speak. On the day of my arrest they put me in a biggish room with several other prisoners, mostly Arabs. They grinned when they saw me enter, and asked me what I'd done. I told them I killed an Arab, and they kept mum for a while. But presently night began to fall, and one of them explained to me how to lay out my sleeping mat. By rolling up one end one makes a sort of bolster. All night I felt bugs crawling over my face. Some days later I was put by myself in a cell, where I slept on a plank bed hinged to the wall. The only other furniture was a latrine bucket and a tin basin. The prison stands on rising ground, and through my little window I had glimpses of the sea. One day when I was hanging on the bars, straining my eyes toward the sunlight playing on the waves, a jailer entered and said I had a visitor. I thought it must be Marie, and so it was. To go to the visitor's room, I was taken along a corridor, then up a flight of steps, then along another corridor. It was a very large room, lit by a big bow window, and divided into 3 compartments by high iron grills running transversally. Between the 2 grills there was a gap of some 30 feet, a sort of no man's land between the prisoners and their friends. I was led to a point exactly opposite Marie, who was wearing her striped dress. On my side of the rails were about a dozen other prisoners, Arabs for the most part. On Marie's side were mostly Moorish women. She was wedged between a small old woman with tight-set lips and a fat matron, without a hat, who was talking shrilly and gesticulated all the time. Because of the distance between the visitors and prisoners I found I, too, had to raise my voice. When I came into the room the babel of voices echoing on the bare walls, and the sunlight streaming in, flooding everything in a harsh white glare, made me feel quite dizzy. After the relative darkness and the silence of my cell it took me some moments to get used to these conditions. After a bit, however, I came to see each face quite clearly, lit up as if a spotlight played on it. I noticed a prison official seated at each end of the no man's land between the grills. The native prisoners and their relations on the other side were squatting opposite each other. They didn't raise their voices and, in spite of the din, managed to converse almost in whispers. This murmur of voices coming from below made a sort of accompaniment to the conversations going on above their heads. I took stock of all this very quickly and moved a step forward toward Marie. She was pressing her brown, suntanned face to the bars and smiling as hard as she could. I thought she was looking very pretty, but somehow couldn't bring myself to tell her so. "Well," she asked, pitching her voice very high. "What about it? Are you all right? Have you everything you want?" "Oh, yes. I've everything I want." We were silent for some moments. Marie went on smiling. The fat woman was bawling at the prisoner beside me, her husband presumably, a tall, fair, pleasant-looking man. Jean refused to have him, she yelled. "That's just too bad," the man replied. "Yes, and I told her you'd take him back the moment you got out, but she wouldn't hear of it." Marie shouted across the gap that Raymond sent me his best wishes, and I said, "Thanks." But my voice was drowned by my neighbors, asking if he was quite fit. The fat woman gave a laugh. "Fit? I should say he is. The picture of health." Meanwhile the prisoner on my left, a youngster with thin, girlish hands, never said a word. His eyes, I noticed, were fixed on the little old woman opposite him, and she returned his gaze with a sort of hungry passion. But I had to stop looking at them as Marie was shouting to me that we mustn't lose hope. "Certainly not," I answered. My gaze fell on her shoulders, and I had a sudden longing to squeeze them, through the thin dress. Its silky texture fascinated me, and I had a feeling that the hope she spoke of centered on it, somehow. I imagined something of the same sort was in Marie's mind, for she went on smiling, looking straight at me. "It'll all come right, you'll see, and then we shall get married." All I could see of her now was the white flash of her teeth, and the little puckers round her eyes. I answered, "Do you really think so?" but chiefly because I felt it up to me to answer something. She started talking very fast in the same high-pitched voice. "Yes, you'll be acquitted, and we'll go bathing again, Sundays." The woman beside me was still yelling away, telling her husband that she'd left a basket for him in the prison office. She gave a list of the things she'd brought and told him to mind and check them carefully, as some had cost quite a lot. The youngster on my other side and his mother were still gazing mournfully at each other, and the murmur of the Arabs droned on below us. The light outside seemed to be surging up against the window, seeping through, and smearing the faces of the people facing it with a coat of yellow oil. I began to feel slightly squeamish, and wished I could leave. The strident voice beside me was jarring on my ears. But, on the other hand, I wanted to have the most I could of Marie's company. I've no idea how much time passed. I remember Marie's describing to me her work, with that set smile always on her face. There wasn't a moment's let-up in the noise, shouts, conversations, and always that muttering undertone. The only oasis of silence was made by the young fellow and the old woman gazing into each other's eyes. Then, one by one, the Arabs were led away. Almost everyone fell silent when the first one left. The little old woman pressed herself against the bars, and at the same moment a jailer tapped her son's shoulder. He called, "Au revoir, mother," and, slipping her hand between the bars, she gave him a small, slow wave with it. No sooner was she gone than a man, hat in hand, took her place. A prisoner was led up to the empty place beside me, and the two started a brisk exchange of remarks, not loud, however, as the room had become relatively quiet. Someone came and called away the man on my right, and his wife shouted at him. She didn't seem to realize it was no longer necessary to shout. "Now, mind you look after yourself, dear, and don't do anything rash." My turn came next. Marie threw me a kiss. I looked back as I walked away. She hadn't moved, her face was still pressed to the rails, her lips still parted in that tense, twisted smile. Soon after this I had a letter from her. And it was then that the things I've never liked to talk about began. Not that they were particularly terrible, I've no wish to exaggerate, and I suffered less than others. Still, there was one thing in those early days that was really irksome, my habit of thinking like a free man. For instance, I would suddenly be seized with a desire to go down to the beach for a swim. And merely to have imagined the sound of ripples at my feet, the smooth feel of the water on my body as I struck out, and the wonderful sensation of relief it gave brought home still more cruelly the narrowness of my cell. Still, that phase lasted a few months only. Afterward, I had prisoner's thoughts. I waited for the daily walk in the courtyard or a visit from my lawyer. As for the rest of the time, I managed quite well, really. I've often thought that had I been compelled to live in the trunk of a dead tree, with nothing to do but gaze up at the patch of sky just overhead, I'd have got used to it by degrees. I'd have learned to watch for the passing of birds or drifting clouds, as I had come to watch for my lawyer's odd neckties, or, in another world, to wait patiently till Sunday for a spell of lovemaking with Marie. Well, here, anyhow, I wasn't penned in a hollow tree trunk. There were others in the world worse off than I. I remembered it had been one of Mother's pet ideas, she was always voicing it, that in the long run one gets used to anything. Usually, however, I didn't think things out so far. Those first months were trying, of course, but the very effort I had to make helped me through them. For instance, I was plagued by the desire for a woman, which was natural enough, considering my age. I never thought of Marie especially. I was obsessed by thoughts of this woman or that, of all the ones I'd had, all the circumstances under which I'd loved them, so much so that the cell grew crowded with their faces, ghosts of my old passions. That unsettled me, no doubt, but, at least, it served to kill time. I gradually became quite friendly with the chief jailer, who went the rounds with the kitchen hands at meal times. It was he who brought up the subject of women. "That's what the men here grumble about most," he told me. I said I felt like that myself. "There's something unfair about it," I added, "like hitting a man when he's down." "But that's the whole point of it," he said, "that's why you fellows are kept in prison." "I don't follow." "Liberty," he said, "means that you're being deprived of your liberty." It had never before struck me in that light, but I saw his point. "That's true," I said. "Otherwise it wouldn't be a punishment." The jailer nodded. "Yes, you're different, you can use your brains. The others can't. Still, those fellows find a way out, they do it by themselves." With which remark the jailer left my cell. Next day I did like the others. The lack of cigarettes, too, was a trial. When I was brought to the prison, they took away my belt, my shoelaces, and the contents of my pockets, including my cigarettes. Once I had been given a cell to myself, I asked to be given back, anyhow, the cigarettes. Smoking was forbidden, they informed me. That, perhaps, was what got me down the most. In fact, I suffered really badly during the first few days. I even tore off splinters from my plank bed and sucked them. All day long I felt faint and bilious. It passed my understanding why I shouldn't be allowed even to smoke, it could have done no one any harm. Later on, I understood the idea behind it, this privation, too, was part of my punishment. But, by the time I understood, I'd lost the craving, so it had ceased to be a punishment. Except for these privations I wasn't too unhappy. Yet again, the whole problem was, how to kill time. After a while, however, once I'd learned the trick of remembering things, I never had a moment's boredom. Sometimes I would exercise my memory on my bedroom and, starting from a corner, make the round, noting every object I saw on the way. At first it was over in a minute or two. But each time I repeated the experience, it took a little longer. I made a point of visualizing every piece of furniture, and each article upon or in it, and then every detail of each article, and finally the details of the details, so to speak, a tiny dent or incrustation, or a chipped edge, and the exact grain and color of the woodwork. At the same time I forced myself to keep my inventory in mind from start to finish, in the right order and omitting no item. With the result that, after a few weeks, I could spend hours merely in listing the objects in my bedroom. I found that the more I thought, the more details, half forgotten or malobserved, floated up from my memory. There seemed no end to them. So I learned that even after a single day's experience of the outside world, a man could easily live 100 years in prison. He'd have laid up enough memories never to be bored. Obviously, in one way, this was a compensation. Then there was sleep. To begin with, I slept badly at night and never in the day. But gradually my nights became better, and I managed to doze off in the daytime as well. In fact, during the last months, I must have slept 16 or 18 hours out of the 24. So there remained only 6 hours to fill, with meals, relieving nature, my memories, and the story of the check. One day, when inspecting my straw mattress, I found a bit of newspaper stuck to its underside. The paper was yellow with age, almost transparent, but I could still make out the letter print. It was the story of a crime. The first part was missing, but I gathered that its scene was some village in Czechoslovakia. One of the villagers had left his home to try his luck abroad. After 25 years, having made a fortune, he returned to his country with his wife and child. Meanwhile, his mother and sister had been running a small hotel in the village where he was born. He decided to give them a surprise and, leaving his wife and child in another inn, he went to stay at his mother's place, booking a room under an assumed name. His mother and sister completely failed to recognize him. At dinner that evening he showed them a large sum of money he had on him, and in the course of the night they slaughtered him with a hammer. After taking the money they flung the body into the river. Next morning his wife came and, without thinking, betrayed the guest's identity. His mother hanged herself. His sister threw herself into a well. I must have read that story thousands of times. In one way it sounded most unlikely, in another, it was plausible enough. Anyhow, to my mind, the man was asking for trouble. One shouldn't play fool tricks of that sort. So, what with long bouts of sleep, my memories, readings of that scrap of newspaper, the tides of light and darkness, the days slipped by. I'd read, of course, that in jail one ends up by losing track of time. But this had never meant anything definite to me. I hadn't grasped how days could be at once long and short. Long, no doubt, as periods to live through, but so distended that they ended up by overlapping on each other. In fact, I never thought of days as such, only the words, yesterday, and tomorrow, still kept some meaning. When, one morning, the jailer informed me I'd now been 6 months in jail, I believed him, but the words conveyed nothing to my mind. To me it seemed like one and the same day that had been going on since I'd been in my cell, and that I'd been doing the same thing all the time. After the jailer left me, I shined up my tin pannikin and studied my face in it. My expression was terribly serious, I thought, even when I tried to smile. I held the pannikin at different angles, but always my face had the same mournful, tense expression. The sun was setting and it was the hour of which I'd rather not speak, the nameless hour, I called it, when evening sounds were creeping up from all the floors of the prison in a sort of stealthy procession. I went to the barred window and in the last rays looked once again at my reflected face. It was as serious as before, and that wasn't surprising, as just then I was feeling serious. But, at the same time, I heard something that I hadn't heard for months. It was the sound of a voice, my own voice, there was no mistaking it. And I recognized it as the voice that for many a day of late had been sounding in my ears. So I knew that all this time I'd been talking to myself. And something I'd been told came back, a remark made by the nurse at Mother's funeral. No, there was no way out, and no one can imagine what the evenings are like in prison. On the whole, I can't say that those months passed slowly. Another summer was on its way almost before I realized the first was over. And I knew that with the first really hot days something new was in store for me. My case was down for the last sessions of the assize court, and those sessions were due to end sometime in June. The day on which my trial started was one of brilliant sunshine. My lawyer assured me the case would take only 2 or 3 days. From what I hear, he added, the court will dispatch your case as quickly as possible, as it isn't the most important one on the cause list. There's a case of parricide immediately after, which will take them some time. They came for me at 7:30 in the morning and I was conveyed to the law courts in a prison van. The two policemen led me into a small room that smelled of darkness. We sat near a door through which came sounds of voices, shouts, chairs scraping on the floor, a vague hubbub which reminded me of one of those small-town socials, when, after the concert's over, the hall is cleared for dancing. One of my policemen told me the judges hadn't arrived yet, and offered me a cigarette, which I declined. After a bit he asked me if I was feeling nervous. I said, no, and that the prospect of witnessing a trial rather interested me. I'd never had occasion to attend one before. Maybe, the other policeman said. But after an hour or two one's had enough of it. After a while a small electric bell purred in the room. They unfastened my handcuffs, opened the door, and led me to the prisoner's dock. There was a great crowd in the courtroom. Though the Venetian blinds were down, light was filtering through the chinks, and the air stiflingly hot already. The windows had been kept shut. I sat down, and the police officers took their stand on each side of my chair. It was then that I noticed a row of faces opposite me. These people were staring hard at me, and I guessed they were the jury. But somehow I didn't see them as individuals. I felt as you do just after boarding a streetcar and you're conscious of all the people on the opposite seat staring at you in the hope of finding something in your appearance to amuse them. Of course, I knew this was an absurd comparison. What these people were looking for in me wasn't anything to laugh at, but signs of criminality. Still, the difference wasn't so very great, and, anyhow, that's the idea I got. What with the crowd and the stuffiness of the air, I was feeling a bit dizzy. I ran my eyes round the courtroom but couldn't recognize any of the faces. At first I could hardly believe that all these people had come on my account. It was such a new experience, being a focus of interest. In the ordinary way no one ever paid much attention to me. What a crush! I remarked to the policeman on my left, and he explained that the newspapers were responsible for it. He pointed to a group of men at a table just below the jury box. There they are. Who? I asked, and he replied, the press. One of them, he added, was an old friend of his. A moment later the man he'd mentioned looked our way and, coming to the dock, shook hands warmly with the policeman. The journalist was an elderly man with a rather grim expression, but his manner was quite pleasant. Just then I noticed that almost all the people in the courtroom were greeting each other, exchanging remarks and forming groups, behaving, in fact, as in a club where the company of others of one's own tastes and standing makes one feel at ease. That, no doubt, explained the odd impression I had of being de trop here, a sort of gatecrasher. However, the journalist addressed me quite amiably, and said he hoped all would go well for me. I thanked him, and he added with a smile, you know, we've been featuring you a bit. We're always rather short of copy in the summer, and there's been precious little to write about except your case and the one that's coming on after it. I expect you've heard about it. It's a case of parricide. He drew my attention to one of the group at the press table, a plump, small man with huge black-rimmed glasses, who made me think of an overfed weasel. That fellow's the special correspondent of one of the Paris dailies. As a matter of fact, he didn't come on your account. He was sent for the parricide case, but they've asked him to cover yours as well. It was on the tip of my tongue to say, that was very kind of them, but then I thought it would sound silly. With a friendly wave of his hand he left us, and for some minutes nothing happened. Then, accompanied by some colleagues, my lawyer bustled in his gown. He went up to the press table and shook hands with the journalists. They remained laughing and chatting together, all seemingly very much at home here, until a bell rang shrilly and everyone went to his place. My lawyer came up to me, shook hands, and advised me to answer all the questions as briefly as possible, not to volunteer information, and to rely on him to see me through. I heard a chair scrape on my left, and a tall, thin man wearing pince-nez settled the folds of his red gown as he took his seat. The public prosecutor, I gathered. A clerk of the court announced that their honors were entering, and at the same moment 2 big electric fans started buzzing overhead. 3 judges, 2 in black and the 3rd in scarlet, with briefcases under their arms, entered and walked briskly to the bench, which was several feet above the level of the courtroom floor. The man in scarlet took the central, high-backed chair, placed his cap of office on the table, ran a handkerchief over his small bald crown, and announced that the hearing would now begin. The journalists had their fountain pens ready, they all wore the same expression of slightly ironical indifference, with the exception of one, a much younger man than his colleagues, in grey flannels with a blue tie, who, leaving his pen on the table, was gazing hard at me. He had a plain, rather chunky face. What held my attention were his eyes, very pale, clear eyes, riveted on me, though not betraying any definite emotion. For a moment I had an odd impression, as if I were being scrutinized by myself. That, and the fact that I was unfamiliar with court procedure, may explain why I didn't follow very well the opening phases, the drawing of lots for the jury, the various questions put by the presiding judge to the prosecutor, the foreman of the jury, and my counsel. Each time he spoke all the jurymen's heads swung round together toward the bench. The hurried reading of the charge sheet, in the course of which I recognized some familiar names of people and places, then some supplementary questions put to my lawyer. Next, the judge announced that the court would call over the witness list. Some of the names read out by the clerk rather surprised me. From amongst the crowd, which until now I had seen as a mere blur of faces, rose, one after the other, Raymond, Masson, Salameno, the doorkeeper from the home, old Perez, and Marie, who gave me a little nervous wave of her hand before following the others out by a side door. I was thinking how strange it was I hadn't noticed any of them before when I heard the last name called, that of Celeste. As he rose, I noticed beside him the quaint little woman with a mannish coat and brisk, decided air, who had shared my table at the restaurant. She had her eyes fixed on me, I noticed. But I hadn't time to wonder about her. The judge had started speaking again. He said that the trial proper was about to begin, and he need hardly say that he expected the public to refrain from any demonstration whatsoever. He explained that he was there to supervise the proceedings, as a sort of umpire, and he would take a scrupulously impartial view of the case. The verdict of the jury would be interpreted by him in a spirit of justice. Finally, at the least sign of a disturbance he would have the court cleared. The day was stoking up. Some of the public were fanning themselves with newspapers, and there was a constant rustle of crumpled paper. On a sign from the presiding judge, the clerk of the court brought 3 fans of plaited straw, which the 3 judges promptly put in action. My examination began at once. The judge questioned me quite calmly and even, I thought, with a hint of cordiality. For the nth time I was asked to give particulars of my identity and, though heartily sick of this formality, I realized that it was natural enough. After all, it would be a shocking thing for the court to be trying the wrong man. The judge then launched into an account of what I'd done, stopping after every 2 or 3 sentences to ask me, "Is that correct?" To which I always replied, "Yes, sir," as my lawyer had advised me. It was a long business, as the judge lingered on each detail. Meanwhile the journalists scribbled busily away. But I was sometimes conscious of the eyes of the youngest fixed on me, also those of the queer little robot woman. The jurymen, however, were all gazing at the red-robed judge, and I was again reminded of the row of passengers on one side of a tram. Presently he gave a slight cough, turned some pages of his file, and, still fanning his face, addressed me gravely. He now proposed, he said, to trench on certain matters which, on a superficial view, might seem foreign to the case, but actually were highly relevant. I guessed that he was going to talk about mother, and at the same moment realized how odious I would find this. His first question was, why had I sent my mother to an institution? I replied that the reason was simple: I hadn't enough money to see that she was properly looked after at home. Then he asked if the parting hadn't caused me distress. I explained that neither mother nor I expected much of one another, or, for that matter, of anybody else, so both of us had got used to the new conditions easily enough. The judge then said that he had no wish to press the point, and asked the prosecutor if he could think of any more questions that should be put to me at this stage. The prosecutor, who had his back half turned to me, said, without looking in my direction, that, subject to his honor's approval, he would like to know if I'd gone back to the stream with the intention of killing the Arab. I said, no. In that case, why had I taken a revolver with me, and why go back precisely to that spot? I said it was a matter of pure chance. The prosecutor then observed in a nasty tone, very good. That will be all for the present. I couldn't quite follow what came next. Anyhow, after some palavering among the bench, the prosecutor and my counsel, the presiding judge announced that the court would now rise. There was an adjournment till the afternoon, when evidence would be taken. Almost before I knew what was happening I was rushed out to the prison van, which drove me back, and I was given my midday meal. After a short time, just enough for me to realize how tired I was feeling, they came for me. I was back in the same room, confronting the same faces, and the whole thing started again. But the heat had meanwhile much increased, and by some miracle fans had been procured for everyone, the jury, my lawyer, the prosecutor, and some of the journalists, too. The young man and the robot woman were still at their places. But they were not fanning themselves and, as before, they never took their eyes off me. I wiped the sweat from my face, but I was barely conscious of where or who I was until I heard the warden of the home called to the witness box. When asked if my mother had complained about my conduct, he said, yes, but that didn't mean much. Almost all the inmates of the home had grievances against their relatives. The judge asked him to be more explicit. Did she reproach me with having sent her to the home? And he said, yes, again. But this time he didn't qualify his answer. To another question, he replied that on the day of the funeral he was somewhat surprised by my calmness. Asked to explain what he meant by my calmness, the warden lowered his eyes and stared at his shoes for a moment. Then he explained that I hadn't wanted to see Mother's body, or shed a single tear, and that I left immediately the funeral ended, without lingering at her grave. Another thing had surprised him. One of the undertaker's men told him that I didn't know my mother's age. There was a short silence. Then the judge asked him if he might take it that he was referring to the prisoner in the dock. The warden seemed puzzled by this, and the judge explained, it's a formal question. I am bound to put it. The prosecutor was then asked if he had any questions to put, and he answered loudly, certainly not. I have all I want. His tone and the look of triumph on his face, as he glanced at me, were so marked that I felt as I hadn't felt for ages. I had a foolish desire to burst into tears. For the first time I'd realized how all these people loathed me. After asking the jury and my lawyer if they had any questions, the judge heard the doorkeeper's evidence. On stepping into the box, the man threw a glance at me, then looked away. Replying to questions, he said that I'd declined to see Mother's body, I'd smoked cigarettes and slept, and drunk café au lait. It was then I felt a sort of wave of indignation spreading through the courtroom, and for the first time I understood that I was guilty. They got the doorkeeper to repeat what he had said about the coffee and my smoking. The prosecutor turned to me again, with a gloating look in his eyes. My counsel asked the doorkeeper if he, too, hadn't smoked. But the prosecutor took strong exception to this. I'd like to know, he cried indignantly, who is on trial in this court. Or does my friend think that by aspersing a witness for the prosecution he will shake the evidence, the abundant and cogent evidence, against his client? Nonetheless, the judge told the doorkeeper to answer the question. The old fellow fidgeted a bit. Then, well, I know I didn't ought to have done it, he mumbled, but I did take a cigarette from the young gentleman when he offered it, just out of politeness. The judge asked me if I had any comment to make. None, I said, except that the witness is quite right. It's true I offered him a cigarette. The doorkeeper looked at me with surprise and a sort of gratitude. Then, after hemming and hawing for a bit, he volunteered the statement that it was he who'd suggested I should have some coffee. My lawyer was exultant. The jury will appreciate, he said, the importance of this admission. The prosecutor, however, was promptly on his feet again. Quite so, he boomed above our heads. The jury will appreciate it. And they will draw the conclusion that, though a third party might inadvertently offer him a cup of coffee, the prisoner, in common decency, should have refused it, if only out of respect for the dead body of the poor woman who had brought him into the world. After which the doorkeeper went back to his seat. When Thomas Perez was called, a court officer had to help him to the box. Perez stated that, though he had been a great friend of my mother, he had met me once only, on the day of the funeral. Asked how I had behaved that day, he said, well, I was most upset, you know. Far too much upset to notice things. My grief sort of blinded me, I think. It had been a great shock, my dear friend's death. In fact, I fainted during the funeral. So I didn't hardly notice the young gentleman at all. The prosecutor asked him to tell the court if he'd seen me weep. And when Perez answered, no, and did emphatically, I trust the jury will take note of this reply. My lawyer rose at once, and asked Perez in a tone that seemed to me needlessly aggressive, now, think well, my man. Can you swear you saw he didn't shed a tear? Perez answered, no. At this some people tittered, and my lawyer, pushing back one sleeve of his gown, said sternly, that is typical of the way this case is being conducted. No attempt is being made to elicit the true facts. The prosecutor ignored this remark. he was making dabs with his pencil on the cover of his brief, seemingly quite indifferent. There was a break of 5 minutes, during which my lawyer told me the case was going very well indeed. Then Celeste was called. He was announced as a witness for the defense. The defense meant me. Now and again Celeste threw me a glance. He kept squeezing his Panama hat between his hands as he gave evidence. He was in his best suit, the one he wore when sometimes of a Sunday he went with me to the races. But evidently he hadn't been able to get his collar on. The top of his shirt, I noticed, was secured only by a brass stud. Asked if I was one of his customers, he said, yes, and a friend as well. Asked to state his opinion of me, he said that I was all right, and, when told to explain what he meant by that, he replied that everyone knew what that meant. Was I a secretive sort of man? No, he answered, I shouldn't call him that. But he isn't one to waste his breath, like a lot of folks. The prosecutor asked him if I always settled my monthly bill at his restaurant when he presented it. Celeste laughed. Oh, he paid on the nail, all right. But the bills were just details like, between him and me. Then he was asked to say what he thought about the crime. He placed his hands on the rail of the box and one could see he had a speech all ready. To my mind it was just an accident, or a stroke of bad luck, if you prefer. And a thing like that takes you off your guard. He wanted to continue, but the judge cut him short. Quite so. That's all, thank you. For a bit Celeste seemed flabbergasted, then he explained that he hadn't finished what he wanted to say. They told him to continue, but to make it brief. He only repeated that it was just an accident. That's as it may be, the judge observed. But what we are here for is to try such accidents, according to law. You can stand down. Celeste turned and gazed at me. His eyes were moist and his lips trembling. It was exactly as if he'd said, well, I've done my best for you, old man. I'm afraid it hasn't helped much. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything, or make any movement, but for the first time in my life I wanted to kiss a man. The judge repeated his order to stand down, and Celeste returned to his place amongst the crowd. During the rest of the hearing he remained there, leaning forward, elbows on knees and his Panama between his hands, not missing a word of the proceedings. It was Marie's turn next. She had a hat on and still looked quite pretty, though I much preferred her with her hair free. From where I was I had glimpses of the soft curve of her breasts, and her underlip had the little pout that always fascinated me. She appeared very nervous. The first question was, how long had she known me? Since the time when she was in our office, she replied. Then the judge asked her what were the relations between us, and she said she was my girlfriend. Answering another question, she admitted promising to marry me. The prosecutor, who had been studying a document in front of him, asked her rather sharply when our liaison had begun. She gave the date. He then observed with a would-be casual air that apparently she meant the day following my mother's funeral. After letting this sink in he remarked in a slightly ironic tone that obviously this was a delicate topic, and he could enter into the young lady's feelings, but, and here his voice grew sterner, his duty obliged him to waive considerations of delicacy. After making this announcement he asked Marie to give a full account of our doings on the day when I had intercourse with her for the first time. Marie wouldn't answer at first, but the prosecutor insisted, and then she told him that we had met at the baths, gone together to the pictures, and then to my place. He then informed the court that, as a result of certain statements made by Marie at the proceedings before the magistrate, he had studied the movie programs of that date, and turning to Marie asked her to name the film that we had gone to see. In a very low voice she said it was a picture with Fernandel in it. By the time she had finished, the courtroom was so still you could have heard a pin drop. Looking very grave, the prosecutor drew himself up to his full height and, pointing at me, said in such a tone that I could have sworn he was genuinely moved, "Gentlemen of the jury. I would have you note that on the next day after his mother's funeral that man was visiting the swimming pool, starting a liaison with a girl, and going to see a comic film. That is all I wish to say." When he sat down there was the same dead silence. Then all of a sudden Marie burst into tears. "He'd got it all wrong," she said. "It wasn't a bit like that really. He bullied her into saying the opposite of what she meant. She knew me very well, and she was sure I hadn't done anything really wrong, and so on." At a sign from the presiding judge, one of the court officers led her away, and the hearing continued. Hardly anyone seemed to listen to Masson, the next witness. He stated that I was a respectable young fellow, and, what's more, a very decent chapter. Nor did they pay any more attention to Salameno, when he told them how kind I'd always been to his dog, or when, in answer to a question about my mother and myself, he said that mother and I had very little in common, and that explained why I'd fixed up for her to enter the home. "You've got to understand," he added. "You've got to understand." But no one seemed to understand. He was told to stand down. Raymond was the next, and last, witness. He gave me a little wave of his hand and led off by saying I was innocent. The judge rebuked him. "You are here to give evidence, not your views on the case, and you must confine yourself to answering the questions put you." He was then asked to make clear his relations with the deceased, and Raymond took this opportunity of explaining that it was he, not I, against whom the dead man had a grudge, because he, Raymond, had beaten up his sister. The judge asked him if the deceased had no reason to dislike me, too. Raymond told him that my presence on the beach that morning was a pure coincidence. "How comes it then," the prosecutor inquired, "that the letter which led up to this tragedy was the prisoner's work?" Raymond replied that this, too, was due to mere chance. To which the prosecutor retorted that in this case, chance, or mere coincidence, seemed to play a remarkably large part. Was it by chance that I hadn't intervened when Raymond assaulted his mistress? Did this convenient term, chance, account for my having vouched for Raymond at the police station and having made, on that occasion, statements extravagantly favorable to him? In conclusion, he asked Raymond to state what were his means of livelihood. On his describing himself as a warehouseman, the prosecutor informed the jury it was common knowledge that the witness lived on the immoral earnings of women. "I," he said, "was this man's intimate friend and associate. In fact, the whole background of the crime was of the most squalid description. And what made it even more odious was the personality of the prisoner, an inhuman monster wholly without a moral sense." Raymond began to expostulate, and my lawyer, too, protested. They were told that the prosecutor must be allowed to finish his remarks. "I have nearly done," he said, then turned to Raymond. "Was the prisoner your friend?" "Certainly. We were the best of pals, as they say." The prosecutor then put me the same question. I looked hard at Raymond, and he did not turn away. Then, "Yes," I answered. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "Not only did the man before you in the dock indulge in the most shameful orgies on the day following his mother's death. He killed a man cold-bloodedly, in pursuance of some sordid vendetta in the underworld of prostitutes and pimps. That, gentlemen of the jury, is the type of man the prisoner is." No sooner had he sat down than my lawyer, out of all patience, raised his arms so high that his sleeves fell back, showing the full length of his starched shirt cuffs. "Is my client on trial for having buried his mother, or for killing a man?" he asked. There were some titters in court. But then the prosecutor sprang to his feet and, draping his gown round him, said he was amazed at his friend's ingenuousness in failing to see that between these two elements of the case there was a vital link. They hung together psychologically, if he might put it so. "In short," he concluded, speaking with great vehemence, "I accuse the prisoner of behaving at his mother's funeral in a way that showed he was already a criminal at heart." These words seemed to take much effect on the jury and public. My lawyer merely shrugged his shoulders and wiped the sweat from his forehead. But obviously he was rattled, and I had a feeling things weren't going well for me. Soon after this incident the court rose. As I was being taken from the courthouse to the prison van, I was conscious for a few brief moments of the once familiar feel of a summer evening out of doors. And, sitting in the darkness of my moving cell, I recognized, echoing in my tired brain, all the characteristic sounds of a town I'd loved, and of a certain hour of the day which I had always particularly enjoyed. The shouts of newspaper boys in the already languid air, the last calls of birds in the public garden, the cries of sandwich vendors, the screech of streetcars at the steep corners of the upper town. And that faint rustling overhead as darkness sifted down upon the harbor, all these sounds made my return to prison like a blind man's journey along a route whose every inch he knows by heart. Yes, this was the evening hour when, how long ago it seemed, I always felt so well content with life. Then, what awaited me was a night of easy, dreamless sleep. This was the same hour, but with a difference. I was returning to a cell, and what awaited me was a night haunted by forebodings of the coming day. And so I learned that familiar paths traced in the dusk of summer evenings may lead as well to prisons as to innocent, untroubled sleep. It is always interesting, even in the prisoner's dock, to hear oneself being talked about. And certainly in the speeches of my lawyer and the prosecuting counsel a great deal was said about me, more, in fact, about me personally than about my crime. Really there wasn't any very great difference between the two speeches. Counsel for the defense raised his arms to heaven and pleaded guilty, but with extenuating circumstances. The prosecutor made similar gestures. He agreed that I was guilty, but denied extenuating circumstances. One thing about this phase of the trial was rather irksome. Quite often, interested as I was in what they had to say, I was tempted to put in a word, myself. But my lawyer had advised me not to. "You won't do your case any good by talking," he had warned me. In fact, there seemed to be a conspiracy to exclude me from the proceedings. I wasn't to have any say, and my fate was to be decided out of hand. It was quite an effort at times for me to refrain from cutting them all short, and saying, "But, damn it all, who's on trial in this court, I'd like to know. It's a serious matter for a man, being accused of murder. And I've something really important to tell you." However, on second thoughts, I found I had nothing to say. In any case, I must admit that hearing oneself talked about loses its interest very soon. The prosecutor's speech, especially, began to bore me before he was halfway through it. The only things that really caught my attention were occasional phrases, his gestures, and some elaborate tirades, but these were isolated patches. What he was aiming at, I gathered, was to show that my crime was premeditated. I remember his saying at one moment, "I can prove this, gentlemen of the jury, to the hilt. First, you have the facts of the crime, which are as clear as daylight. And then you have what I may call the night side of this case, the dark workings of a criminal mentality." He began by summing up the facts, from my mother's death onward. He stressed my heartlessness, my inability to state mother's age, my visit to the swimming pool where I met Marie, our matinee at the pictures where a Fernandel film was showing, and finally my return with Marie to my rooms. I didn't quite follow his remarks at first, as he kept on mentioning the prisoner's mistress, whereas for me she was just Marie. Then he came to the subject of Raymond. It seemed to me that his way of treating the facts showed a certain shrewdness. All he said sounded quite plausible. I'd written the letter in collusion with Raymond so as to entice his mistress to his room and subject her to ill treatment by a man of more than dubious reputation. Then, on the beach, I'd provoked a brawl with Raymond's enemies, in the course of which Raymond was wounded. I'd asked him for his revolver and gone back by myself with the intention of using it. Then I'd shot the Arab. After the first shot I waited. Then, to be certain of making a good job of it, I fired 4 more shots deliberately, point blank, and in cold blood, at my victim. "That is my case," he said. "I have described to you the series of events which led this man to kill the deceased, fully aware of what he was doing. I emphasize this point. We are not concerned with an act of homicide committed on a sudden impulse which might serve as extenuation. I ask you to note, gentlemen of the jury, that the prisoner is an educated man. You will have observed the way in which he answered my questions. He is intelligent and he knows the value of words. And I repeat that it is quite impossible to assume that, when he committed the crime, he was unaware what he was doing. I noticed that he laid stress on my intelligence. It puzzled me rather why what would count as a good point in an ordinary person should be used against an accused man as an overwhelming proof of his guilt. While thinking this over, I missed what he said next, until I heard him exclaim indignantly, "And has he uttered a word of regret for his most odious crime?" Not one word, gentlemen. Not once in the course of these proceedings did this man show the least contrition. Turning toward the dock, he pointed a finger at me and went on in the same strain. I really couldn't understand why he harped on this point so much. Of course, I had to own that he was right. I didn't feel much regret for what I'd done. Still, to my mind he overdid it, and I'd have liked to have a chance of explaining to him, in a quite friendly, almost affectionate way, that I have never been able really to regret anything in all my life. I've always been far too much absorbed in the present moment, or the immediate future, to think back. Of course, in the position into which I had been forced, there was no question of my speaking to anyone in that tone. I hadn't the right to show any friendly feeling or possess good intentions. And I tried to follow what came next, as the prosecutor was now considering what he called my soul. He said he'd studied it closely, and had found a blank, literally nothing, gentlemen of the jury. Really, he said, I had no soul, there was nothing human about me, not one of those moral qualities which normal men possess had any place in my mentality. No doubt, he added, we should not reproach him with this. We cannot blame a man for lacking what it was never in his power to acquire. But in a criminal court the wholly passive ideal of tolerance must give place to a sterner, loftier ideal, that of justice. Especially when this lack of every decent instinct is such as that of the man before you, a menace to society. He proceeded to discuss my conduct toward my mother, repeating what he had said in the course of the hearing. But he spoke at much greater length of my crime, at such length, indeed, that I lost the thread and was conscious only of the steadily increasing heat. A moment came when the prosecutor paused and, after a short silence, said in a low, vibrant voice, "This same court, gentlemen, will be called on to try tomorrow that most odious of crimes, the murder of a father by his son." To his mind, such a crime was almost unimaginable. But, he ventured to hope, justice would be meted out without paltering. And yet, he made bold to say, the horror that even the crime of parricide inspired in him paled beside the loathing inspired by my callousness. This man, who is morally guilty of his mother's death, is no less unfit to have a place in the community than that other man who did to death the father that begat him. And, indeed, the one crime led on to the other. The first of these two criminals, the man in the dock, set a precedent, if I may put it so, and authorized the second crime. Yes, gentlemen, I am convinced, here he raised his voice a tone, that you will not find I am exaggerating the case against the prisoner when I say that he is also guilty of the murder to be tried tomorrow in this court. And I look to you for a verdict accordingly. The prosecutor paused again, to wipe the sweat off his face. He then explained that his duty was a painful one, but he would do it without flinching. This man has, I repeat, no place in a community whose basic principles he flouts without compunction. Nor, heartless as he is, has he any claim to mercy. I ask you to impose the extreme penalty of the law, and I ask it without a qualm. In the course of a long career, in which it has often been my duty to ask for a capital sentence, never have I felt that painful duty weigh so little on my mind as in the present case. In demanding a verdict of murder without extenuating circumstances, I am following not only the dictates of my conscience and a sacred obligation, but also those of the natural and righteous indignation I feel at the sight of a criminal devoid of the least spark of human feeling. When the prosecutor sat down there was a longish silence. Personally, I was quite overcome by the heat and my amazement at what I had been hearing. The presiding judge gave a short cough, and asked me in a very low tone if I had anything to say. I rose, and as I felt in the mood to speak, I said the first thing that crossed my mind, that I had no intention of killing the Arab. The judge replied that this statement would be taken into consideration by the court. Meanwhile he would be glad to hear, before my counsel addressed the court, what were the motives of my crime. So far, he must admit, he hadn't fully understood the grounds of my defense. I tried to explain that it was because of the son, but I spoke too quickly and ran my words into each other. I was only too conscious that it sounded nonsensical, and, in fact, I heard people tittering. My lawyer shrugged his shoulders. Then he was directed to address the court, in his turn. But all he did was to point out the lateness of the hour and to ask for an adjournment till the following afternoon. To this the judge agreed. When I was brought back next day, the electric fans were still churning up the heavy air and the jurymen plying their gaudy little fans in a sort of steady rhythm. The speech for the defense seemed to me interminable. At one moment, however, I pricked up my ears. It was when I heard him saying, "It is true I killed a man." He went on in the same strain, saying, when he referred to me. It seemed so queer that I bent toward the policeman on my right and asked him to explain. He told me to shut up, then, after a moment, whispered, "They all do that." It seemed to me that the idea behind it was still further to exclude me from the case, to put me off the map. So to speak, by substituting the lawyer for myself. Anyway, it hardly mattered. I already felt worlds away from this courtroom and its tedious proceedings. My lawyer, in any case, struck me as feeble to the point of being ridiculous. He hurried through his plea of provocation, and then he, too, started in about my soul. But I had an impression that he had much less talent than the prosecutor. I, too, he said, have closely studied this man's soul, but, unlike my learned friend for the prosecution, I have found something there. Indeed, I may say that I have read the prisoner's mind like an open book. What he had read there was that I was an excellent young fellow, a steady, conscientious worker who did his best by his employer, that I was popular with everyone and sympathetic in others' troubles. According to him I was a dutiful son, who had supported his mother as long as he was able. After anxious consideration, I had reached the conclusion that, by entering a home, the old lady would have comforts that my means didn't permit me to provide for her. I am astounded, gentlemen, he added, by the attitude taken up by my learned friend in referring to this home. Surely, if proof be needed of the excellence of such institutions, we need only remember that they are promoted and financed by a government department. I noticed that he made no reference to the funeral, and this seemed to me a serious omission. But, what with his long-windedness, the endless days and hours they had been discussing my soul, and the rest of it, I found that my mind had gone blurred, everything was dissolving into a greyish, watery haze. Only one incident stands out. Toward the end, while my counsel rambled on, I heard the tin trumpet of an ice cream vendor in the street, a small, shrill sound cutting across the flow of words. And then a rush of memories went through my mind, memories of a life which was mine no longer and had once provided me with the surest, humblest pleasures, warm smells of summer, my favorite streets, the sky at evening, Marie's dresses, and her laugh. The futility of what was happening here seemed to take me by the throat. I felt like vomiting, and I had only one idea: to get it over, to go back to my cell, and sleep, and sleep. Dimly I heard my counsel making his last appeal. Gentlemen of the jury, surely you will not send to his death a decent, hard-working young man, because for one tragic moment he lost his self-control. Is he not sufficiently punished by the lifelong remorse that is to be his lot? I confidently await your verdict, the only verdict possible, that of homicide with extenuating circumstances. The court rose, and the lawyer sat down, looking thoroughly exhausted. Some of his colleagues came to him and shook his hand. "You put up a magnificent show, old man," I heard one of them say. Another lawyer even called me to witness. "Fine, wasn't it?" I agreed, but insincerely. I was far too tired to judge if it had been fine or otherwise. Meanwhile, the day was ending and the heat becoming less intense. By some vague sounds that reached me from the street, I knew that the cool of the evening had set in. We all sat on, waiting. And what we all were waiting for really concerned nobody but me. I looked round the courtroom. It was exactly as it had been on the first day. I met the eyes of the journalist in grey and the robot woman. This reminded me that not once during the whole hearing had I tried to catch Marie's eye. It wasn't that I'd forgotten her, only I was too preoccupied. I saw her now, seated between Celeste and Raymond. She gave me a little wave of her hand, as if to say, "At last." She was smiling, but I could tell that she was rather anxious. But my heart seemed turned to stone, and I couldn't even return her smile. The judges came back to their seats. Someone read out to the jury, very rapidly, a string of questions. I caught a word here and there. Murder of malice aforethought. Provocation. Extenuating circumstances. The jury went out, and I was taken to the little room where I had already waited. My lawyer came to see me. He was very talkative and showed more cordiality and confidence than ever before. He assured me that all would go well and I'd get off with a few years' imprisonment or transportation. I asked him what were the chances of getting the sentence quashed. He said there was no chance of that. He had not raised any point of law, as this was apt to prejudice the jury. And it was difficult to get a judgment quashed except on technical grounds. I saw his point, and agreed. Looking at the matter dispassionately, I shared his view. Otherwise there would be no end to litigation. In any case, the lawyer said, you can appeal in the ordinary way. But I'm convinced the verdict will be favorable. We waited for quite a while, a good 3/4 of an hour, I should say. Then a bell rang. My lawyer left me, saying, the foreman of the jury will read out the answers. You will be called on after that to hear the judgment. Some doors banged. I heard people hurrying down flights of steps, but couldn't tell whether they were nearby or distant. Then I heard a voice droning away in the courtroom. When the bell rang again and I stepped back into the dock, the silence of the courtroom closed in round me, and with the silence came a queer sensation when I noticed that, for the first time, the young journalist kept his eyes averted. I didn't look in Marie's direction. In fact, I had no time to look, as the presiding judge had already started pronouncing a rigmarole to the effect that, in the name of the French people, I was to be decapitated in some public place. It seemed to me then that I could interpret the look on the faces of those present. It was one of almost respectful sympathy. The policeman, too, handled me very gently. The lawyer placed his hand on my wrist. I had stopped thinking altogether. I heard the judge's voice asking if I had anything more to say. After thinking for a moment, I answered, "No." Then the policeman led me out. I have just refused, for the third time, to see the prison chaplain. I have nothing to say to him, don't feel like talking, and shall be seeing him quite soon enough, anyway. The only thing that interests me now is the problem of circumventing the machine, learning if the inevitable admits a loophole. They have moved me to another cell. In this one, lying on my back, I can see the sky, and there is nothing else to see. All my time is spent in watching the slowly changing colors of the sky as day moves on to night. I put my hands behind my head, gaze up, and wait. This problem of a loophole obsesses me. I am always wondering if there have been cases of condemned prisoners escaping from the implacable machinery of justice at the last moment, breaking through the police cordon, vanishing in the nick of time before the guillotine falls. Often and often I blame myself for not having given more attention to accounts of public executions. One should always take an interest in such matters. There's never any knowing what one may come to. Like everyone else, I'd read descriptions of executions in the papers. But technical books dealing with this subject must certainly exist, only I'd never felt sufficiently interested to look them up. And in these books I might have found escape stories. Surely they'd have told me that in one case, anyhow, the wheels had stopped, that once, if only once, in that inexorable march of events, chance or luck had played a happy part. Just once. In a way I think that single instance would have satisfied me. My emotion would have done the rest. The papers often talk of a debt owed to society, a debt which, according to them, must be paid by the offender. But talk of that sort doesn't touch the imagination. No, the one thing that counted for me was the possibility of making a dash for it and defeating their bloodthirsty right, of a mad stampede to freedom that would anyhow give me a moment's hope, the gambler's last throw. Naturally, all that hope could come to was to be knocked down at the corner of a street or picked off by a bullet in my back. But, all things considered, even this luxury was forbidden me. I was caught in the rat trap irrevocably. Try as I might, I couldn't stomach this brutal certitude. For really, when one came to think of it, there was a disproportion between the judgment on which it was based and the unalterable sequence of events starting from the moment when that judgment was delivered. The fact that the verdict was read out at 8 p.m. rather than at 5, the fact that it might have been quite different, that it was given by men who changed their underclothes, and was credited to so vague an entity as the French people, for that matter, why not to the Chinese or the German people, all these facts seemed to deprive the court's decision of much of its gravity. Yet I could but recognize that, from the moment the verdict was given, its effects became as cogent, as tangible, as, for example, this wall against which I was lying, pressing my back to it. When such thoughts crossed my mind, I remembered a story Mother used to tell me about my father. I never set eyes on him. Perhaps the only things I really knew about him were what Mother had told me. One of these was that he'd gone to see a murderer executed. The mere thought of it turned his stomach. But he'd seen it through and, on coming home, was violently sick. At the time, I found my father's conduct rather disgusting. But now I understood, it was so natural. How had I failed to recognize that nothing was more important than an execution, that, viewed from one angle, it's the only thing that can genuinely interest a man? And I decided that, if ever I got out of jail, I'd attend every execution that took place. I was unwise, no doubt, even to consider this possibility. For, the moment I pictured myself in freedom, standing behind a double rank of policemen, on the right side of the line, so to speak, the mere thought of being an onlooker who comes to see the show, and can go home and vomit afterward, flooded my mind with a wild, absurd exultation. It was a stupid thing to let my imagination run away with me like that. A moment later I had a shivering fit and had to wrap myself closely in my blanket. But my teeth went on chattering, nothing would stop them. Still, obviously, one can't be sensible all the time. Another equally ridiculous fancy of mine was to frame new laws, altering the penalties. What was wanted, to my mind, was to give the criminal a chance, if only a dog's chance, say, 1 chance in 1,000. There might be some drug, or combination of drugs, which would kill the patient. I thought of him as the patient, 990 times in 1,000. That he should know this was, of course, essential. For after taking much thought, calmly, I came to the conclusion that what was wrong about the guillotine was that the condemned man had no chance at all, absolutely none. In fact, the patient's death had been ordained irrevocably. It was a foregone conclusion. If by some fluke the knife didn't do its job, they started again. So it came to this, that, against the grain, no doubt, the condemned man had to hope the apparatus was in good working order. This, I thought, was a flaw in the system, and, on the face of it, my view was sound enough. On the other hand, I had to admit it proved the efficiency of the system. It came to this, the man under sentence was obliged to collaborate mentally. It was in his interest that all should go off without a hitch. Another thing I had to recognize was that, until now, I'd had wrong ideas on the subject. For some reason I'd always supposed that one had to go up steps and climb onto a scaffold, to be guillotined. Probably that was because of the 1789 revolution, I mean, what I'd learned about it at school, and the pictures I had seen. Then one morning I remembered a photograph the newspapers had featured on the occasion of the execution of a famous criminal. Actually, the apparatus stood on the ground, there was nothing very impressive about it, and it was much narrower than I'd imagined. It struck me as rather odd that picture had escaped my memory until now. What had struck me at the time was the neat appearance of the guillotine. Its shining surfaces and finish reminded me of some laboratory instrument. One always has exaggerated ideas about what one doesn't know. Now I had to admit it seemed a very simple process, getting guillotined. The machine is on the same level as the man, and he walks toward it as he steps forward to meet somebody he knows. In a sense, that, too, was disappointing. The business of climbing a scaffold, leaving the world below, so to speak, gave something for a man's imagination to get hold of. But, as it was, the machine dominated everything. They killed you discreetly, with a hint of shame and much efficiency. There were two other things about which I was always thinking, the dawn and my appeal. However, I did my best to keep my mind off these thoughts. I lay down, looked up at the sky, and forced myself to study it. When the light began to turn green, the first knew that night was coming. Another thing I did to deflect the course of my thoughts was to listen to my heart. I couldn't imagine that this faint throbbing which had been with me for so long would ever cease. Imagination has never been one of my strong points. Still, I tried to picture a moment when the beating of my heart no longer echoed in my head. But, in vain. The dawn and my appeal were still there. And I ended by believing it was a silly thing to try to force one's thoughts out of their natural groove. They always came for one at dawn, that much I knew. So, really, all my nights were spent in waiting for that dawn. I have never liked being taken by surprise. When something happens to me, I want to be ready for it. That's why I got into the habit of sleeping off and on in the daytime and watching through the night for the first hint of daybreak in the dark dome above. The worst period of the night was that vague hour when, I knew, they usually come. Once it was after midnight I waited, listening intently. Never before had my ears perceived so many noises, such tiny sounds. Still, I must say I was lucky in one respect, never during any of those periods did I hear footsteps. Mother used to say that however miserable one is, there's always something to be thankful for. And each morning, when the sky brightened and light began to flood my cell, I agreed with her. Because I might just as well have heard footsteps and felt my heart shattered into bits. Even though the faintest rustle sent me hurrying to the door and, pressing an ear to the rough, cold wood, I listened so intently that I could hear my breathing, quick and hoarse like a dog's panting. Even so there was an end. My heart hadn't split, and I knew I had another 24 hours respite. Then all day there was my appeal to think about. I made the most of this idea, studying my effects so as to squeeze out the maximum of consolation. Thus, I always began by assuming the worst. My appeal was dismissed. That meant, of course, I was to die. Sooner than others, obviously. But, I reminded myself, it's common knowledge that life isn't worth living, anyhow. And, on a wide view, I could see that it makes little difference whether one dies at the age of 30 or 70, since, in either case, other men and women will continue living, the world will go on as before. Also, whether I died now or 40 years hence, this business of dying had to be got through, inevitably. Still, somehow this line of thought wasn't as consoling as it should have been. The idea of all those years of life in hand was a galling reminder. However, I could argue myself out of it, by picturing what would have been my feelings when my term was up, and death had cornered me. Once you're up against it, the precise manner of your death has obviously small importance. Therefore, but it was hard not to lose the thread of the argument leading up to that. Therefore, I should be prepared to face the dismissal of my appeal. At this stage, but only at this stage, I had, so to speak, the right, and accordingly I gave myself leave to consider the other alternative, that my appeal was successful. And then the trouble was to calm down that sudden rush of joy racing through my body and even bringing tears to my eyes. But it was up to me to bring my nerves to heel and steady my mind, for, even in considering this possibility, I had to keep some order in my thoughts, so as to make my consolations, as regards the first alternative, more plausible. When I'd succeeded, I had earned a good hour's peace of mind, and that, anyhow, was something. It was at one of these moments that I refused once again to see the chaplain. I was lying down and could mark the summer evening coming on by a soft golden glow spreading across the sky. I had just turned down my appeal, and felt my blood circulating with slow, steady throbs. No, I didn't want to see the chaplain. Then I did something I hadn't done for quite a while. I fell to thinking about Marie. She hadn't written for ages, probably, I surmised, she had grown tired of being the mistress of a man sentenced to death. Or she might be ill, or dead. After all, such things happen. How could I have known about it, since, apart from our two bodies, separated now, there was no link between us, nothing to remind us of each other? Supposing she were dead, her memory would mean nothing. I couldn't feel an interest in a dead girl. This seemed to me quite normal, just as I realized people would soon forget me once I was dead. I couldn't even say that this was hard to stomach. Really, there's no idea to which one doesn't get acclimatized in time. My thoughts had reached this point when the chaplain walked in, unannounced. I couldn't help giving a start on seeing him. He noticed this evidently, as he promptly told me not to be alarmed. I reminded him that usually his visits were at another hour, and for a pretty grim occasion. This, he replied, was just a friendly visit. It had no concern with my appeal, about which he knew nothing. Then he sat down on my bed, asking me to sit beside him. I refused, not because I had anything against him. He seemed a mild, amiable man. He remained quite still at first, his arms resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on his hands. They were slender but sinewy hands, which made me think of two nimble little animals. Then he gently rubbed them together. He stayed so long in the same position that for a while I almost forgot he was there. All of a sudden he jerked his head up and looked me in the eyes. "Why," he asked, "don't you let me come to see you?" I explained that I didn't believe in God. "Are you really so sure of that?" I said I saw no point in troubling my head about the matter. Whether I believed or didn't was, to my mind, a question of so little importance. He then leaned back against the wall, laying his hands flat on his thighs. Almost without seeming to address me, he remarked that he'd often noticed one fancies one is quite sure about something, when in point of fact one isn't. When I said nothing, he looked at me again, and asked, "Don't you agree?" I said that seemed quite possible. But, though I mightn't be so sure about what interested me, I was absolutely sure about what didn't interest me. And the question he had raised didn't interest me at all. He looked away and, without altering his posture, asked if it was because I felt utterly desperate that I spoke like this. I explained that it wasn't despair I felt, but fear, which was natural enough. "In that case," he said firmly, "God can help you. All the men I've seen in your position turn to him in their time of trouble." "Obviously," I replied, "they were at liberty to do so, if they felt like it. I, however, didn't want to be helped, and I hadn't time to work up interest for something that didn't interest me." He fluttered his hands fretfully, then, sitting up, smoothed out his cassock. When this was done he began talking again, addressing me as "my friend." It wasn't because I'd been condemned to death, he said, that he spoke to me in this way. In his opinion every man on the earth was under sentence of death. There, I interrupted him, that wasn't the same thing, I pointed out, and, what's more, could be no consolation. He nodded. "Maybe. Still, if you don't die soon, you'll die one day. And then the same question will arise. How will you face that terrible, final hour?" I replied that I'd face it exactly as I was facing it now. Thereat he stood up, and looked me straight in the eyes. It was a trick I knew well. I used to amuse myself trying it on Emmanuel and Celeste, and 9 times out of 10 they'd look away uncomfortably. I could see the chaplain was an old hand at it, as his gaze never faltered. And his voice was quite steady when he said, "Have you no hope at all? Do you really think that when you die outright, and nothing remains?" I said, "Yes." He dropped his eyes and sat down again. He was truly sorry for me, he said. It must make life unbearable for a man to think as I did. The priest was beginning to bore me, and, resting a shoulder on the wall, just beneath the little skylight, I looked away. Though I didn't trouble much to follow what he said, I gathered he was questioning me again. Presently his tone became agitated, urgent, and, as I realized that he was genuinely distressed, I began to pay more attention. He said he felt convinced my appeal would succeed, but I was saddled with a load of guilt, of which I must get rid. In his view, man's justice was a vain thing, only God's justice mattered. I pointed out that the former had condemned me. Yes, he agreed, but it hadn't absolved me from my sin. I told him that I wasn't conscious of any sin, all I knew was that I'd been guilty of a criminal offense. Well, I was paying the penalty of that offense, and no one had the right to expect anything more of me. Just then he got up again, and it struck me that if he wanted to move in this tiny cell, almost the only choice lay between standing up and sitting down. I was staring at the floor. He took a single step toward me and halted, as if he didn't dare to come nearer. Then he looked up through the bars at the sky. "You're mistaken, my son," he said gravely. "There's more that might be required of you. And perhaps it will be required of you." "What do you mean?" "You might be asked to see what?" Slowly the priest gazed round my cell, and I was struck by the sadness of his voice when he replied, "These stone walls, I know it only too well, are steeped in human suffering. I've never been able to look at them without a shudder. And yet, believe me, I am speaking from the depths of my heart, I know that even the wretchedest amongst you have sometimes seen, taking form against that grayness, a divine face. It's that face you are asked to see." This roused me a little. I informed him that I'd been staring at those walls for months. There was nobody, nothing in the world I knew better than I knew them. And once upon a time, perhaps, I used to try to see a face. But it was a sun-gold face, lit up with desire, Marie's face. I had no luck, I'd never seen it, and now I'd given up trying. Indeed, I'd never seen anything, taking form, as he called it, against those grey walls. The chaplain gazed at me with a sort of sadness. I now had my back to the wall and light was flowing over my forehead. He muttered some words I didn't catch, then abruptly asked if he might kiss me. I said, no, then he turned, came up to the wall, and slowly drew his hand along it. "Do you really love these earthly things so very much?" he asked in a low voice. I made no reply. For quite a while he kept his eyes averted. His presence was getting more and more irksome, and I was on the point of telling him to go and leave me in peace, when all of a sudden he swung round on me and burst out passionately, "No. No? I refuse to believe it. I'm sure you've often wished there was an afterlife." Of course I had, I told him. Everybody has that wish at times. But that had no more importance than wishing to be rich, or to swim very fast, or to have a better-shaped mouth. It was in the same order of things. I was going on in the same vein, when he cut in with a question. How did I picture the life after the grave? I fairly bawled out at him, "A life in which I can remember this life on earth. That's all I want of it." And in the same breath I told him I'd had enough of his company. But, apparently, he had more to say on the subject of God. I went close up to him and made a last attempt to explain that I'd very little time left, and I wasn't going to waste it on God. Then he tried to change the subject by asking me why I hadn't once addressed him as "Father," seeing that he was a priest. That irritated me still more, and I told him he wasn't my father, quite the contrary, he was on the other side. "No, no, my son," he said, laying his hand on my shoulder. "I'm on your side, though you don't realize it, because your heart is hardened. But I shall pray for you." Then, I don't know how it was, but something seemed to break inside me, and I started yelling at the top of my voice. I hurled insults at him. I told him not to waste his rotten prayers on me, it was better to burn than to disappear. I'd taken him by the neckband of his cassock, and, in a sort of ecstasy of joy and rage, I poured out on him all the thoughts that had been simmering in my brain. He seemed so cocksure, you see. And yet none of his certainties was worth one strand of a woman's hair. Living as he did, like a corpse, he couldn't even be sure of being alive. It might look as if my hands were empty. Actually, I was sure of myself, sure about everything, far surer than he, sure of my present life and of the death that was coming. That, no doubt, was all I had, but at least that certainty was something I could get my teeth into, just as it had got its teeth into me. I'd been right, I was still right, I was always right. I'd passed my life in a certain way, and I might have passed it in a different way, if I'd felt like it. I'd acted thus, and I hadn't acted otherwise, I hadn't done X, whereas I had done Y or Z. And what did that mean? That, all the time, I'd been waiting for this present moment, for that dawn, tomorrow's or another day's, which was to justify me. Nothing had the least importance, and I knew quite well why. He, too, knew why. From the dark horizon of my future a sort of slow, persistent breeze had been blowing toward me all my life long, from the years that were to come. And on its way that breeze had leveled out all the ideas that people tried to foist on me in the equally unreal years I then was living through. What difference could they make to me, the deaths of others, or a mother's love, or his God, or the way a man decides to live, the fate he thinks he chooses, since one and the same fate was bound to choose, not only me but thousands of millions of privileged people who, like him, called themselves my brothers. Surely he must see that. Every man alive was privileged, there was only one class of men, the privileged class. All alike would be condemned to die one day, his turn, too, would come like the others. And what difference could it make if, after being charged with murder, he were executed because he didn't weep at his mother's funeral, since it all came to the same thing in the end? The same thing for Salamano's wife and for Salamano's dog. That little robot woman was as guilty as the girl from Paris who had married Masson, or as Marie, who wanted me to marry her. What did it matter if Raymond was as much my pal as Celeste, who was a far worthier man? What did it matter if at this very moment Marie was kissing a new boyfriend? As a condemned man himself, couldn't he grasp what I meant by that dark wind blowing from my future? I had been shouting so much that I'd lost my breath, and just then the jailers rushed in and started trying to release the chaplain from my grip. One of them made as if to strike me. The chaplain quietened them down, then gazed at me for a moment without speaking. I could see tears in his eyes. Then he turned and left the cell. Once he'd gone, I felt calm again. But all this excitement had exhausted me and I dropped heavily onto my sleeping plank. I must have had a longish sleep, for, when I woke, the stars were shining down on my face. Sounds of the countryside came faintly in, and the cool night air, veined with smells of earth and salt, fanned my cheeks. The marvelous peace of the sleep-bound summer night flooded through me like a tide. Then, just on the edge of daybreak, I heard a steamer's siren. People were starting on a voyage to a world which had ceased to concern me forever. Almost for the first time in many months I thought of my mother. And now, it seemed to me, I understood why at her life's end she had taken on a fiancé, why she'd played at making a fresh start. There, too, in that home where lives were flickering out, the dusk came as a mournful solace. With death so near, mother must have felt like someone on the brink of freedom, ready to start life all over again. No one in the world had any right to weep for her. And I, too, felt ready to start life all over again. It was as if that great rush of anger had washed me clean, emptied me of hope, and, gazing up at the dark sky spangled with its signs and stars, for the first time, I laid my heart open to the benign indifference of the universe. To feel it so like myself, indeed, so brotherly, made me realize that I'd been happy, and that I was happy still. For all to be accomplished, for me to feel less lonely, all that remained to hope was that on the day of my execution there should be a huge crowd of spectators and that they should greet me with howls of execration.